The Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy, this is our, well, it's our, what, fourth or fifth or however many meetings, and each of these has a different focus. Tonight we're going to talk on the impact, 10th? Sorry, thanks, George. The impact of women, impact of war on women, and we have a very special guest. And I think in the tradition of this book and what Phyllis was doing, as someone said as I walked in, when you get a chance to hear the background and understand the policy and the history, you can see more what's happening. You can address more forcefully the arguments that are being pushed on the American people and pushed on all of us. So it's an important gathering. Let me just mention the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy, in their own words, believes that the United States must pursue a realistic and restrained foreign policy. Foundational to responsible and thoughtful foreign policy is the need for congressional consent for all acts of war. Too often, Congress has taken a backseat in directing military actions, acquiescing to the President. The Constitution spells out in Article 1 that the authority to authorize war comes exclusively from Congress. It's one of the reasons I know why we're in the shadow of the Congress, so we can get people here from staffs and they can hear that we're here and get members. So it's an important. The Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy, it's only my third or fourth meeting, but I'm invested in this. This is important what's happening, and we need more people here. We need more people who understand that this is not a right-left debate. This is a constitutional debate, and there's a lot of room for right and left to get in the room on the Constitution and make a big difference. So we're excited to be here. Now, I was trying to think of the best way to introduce our very accomplished speaker, Kristina Arriaga. First, I was going to say she's married to a Marine. My brother's a Marine. I speak Marine. This is not easy, so congratulations on being married to a Marine. I won't tease you by, I always tell my brother's wife, are you happily married to a Marine? But that's a problem, a different thing. And I was going to talk about her children. She told me her children are also successful, which made me worried because my 4 children I can't imagine. So I decided not to do that. And then I decided that I told her that Helen Marie Taylor, the 95-year-old, Ron knows her very well, 95-year-old chairman of my board, saw that I was coming to speak to and introduce this woman. And she emailed and said, back when, you'll tell the story better than I will, Helen Marie met with, I don't know which dignitary, you were the translator in the room, and received an award from the James Monroe Foundation for your great work on behalf of America and the service. So it was, Helen Marie gave me approval to be here, so it's great to be here. So Kristina Arriaga is the president of the Oxford Society for Law and Religion. She's worked for the Defense of Religious Freedom. Most of you know that in here. She's been on the U.S. delegation to the UN Human Rights Commission, executive director of a public interest law firm. She recently, last few years, was appointed by the Speaker to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She's had a wide career in communications. I heard her counseling someone over here. I don't think she's going to charge the full hour rate, whoever that was. And she's appeared on all the different television and managed, what did Phyllis call it? Managed news networks. So without further ado, Kristina Arriaga. Kristina?
Helen Marie Taylor, wow, that's a blast from the past. I started very young, just want to say. So in the 80s, President Reagan said that he really wanted to stick it to the Russians at what was called then the United Nations Human Rights Commission. So he named U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission a man who had spent 22 years in prison in Cuba. His name is still alive, Armando Valladares, and he wrote a New York Times bestseller called Against All Hope about his time in prison. The president read it, the president named him, but Armando was always very suspicious of interpreters, and I was a policy advisor on torture issues in Cuba, but he insisted that only I could translate for him when he never learned to speak English. He only spoke Spanish and French. So as a result, I was 24 years old, and I thought it was completely normal that I would hang out with President Reagan. President Reagan, and this is going to be the only funny moment of my presentation, President Reagan always wanted to tell jokes about the Russians and the cowboys. Well, if anyone speaks more than one language, you know that jokes don't translate. So I'm in the Oval Office, and the president says, I'm going to tell Armando a joke. And I said, he's going to tell you a joke when I hit your shoe, you laugh. It's the punchline. So he tells a joke, and I wish I would have written it down. He was like cowboy and a Russian, but I was like perspiring the entire time, thinking I'm gonna miss the punchline. So sure enough, tells the punchline, and I hit his shoe, and he laughed hysterically. And then Then Armando says, I'm going to tell him a joke. And I'm like, no, you cannot tell him a joke. I cannot tell the president I'm going to hit his shoe. Tell him I'm going to tell him a joke. I'm like, no, you can't tell him a joke. So the president goes, is there something going on? I said, Mr. President, he wants to tell you a joke. So I told a joke. I'm sure but the president was very kind and he laughed at the right, appropriate time. So anyway, Helen Marie Taylor is from that era. So that reminded me of the story. So I have spent my entire life working on human rights issues. I've been very fortunate to be able to devote my life to something I really care about. Part of it is because I grew up with it. My father escaped Fidel Castro's Cuba because of religious freedom issues. My mother was in a camp, in concentration camp in Leipzig during the Nazi regime. And we grew up in our house with a very strong commitment to the idea that we had to be grateful to this country that had given us the opportunity to live in freedom, and we had to participate in the process. So my brother became a businessman in Florida, which he thought was the right thing to do. My sister lives in North Carolina, and I have been in the NGO world for many, many years. I thank you for addressing this issue of war on women, because it's one that has been very close to my heart. I have traveled around the world and visited refugee camps in Nigeria and Iraq, and most recently I was in India talking about trafficking in Istanbul and Buenos Aires, and unfortunately it's a topic that not a lot of people are talking about, surprisingly. And the very best predictor of a state's ability to become a peaceful state is not its wealth, is not its ethno-religious background, is not its level of democracy, it's how women are treated. And this is not, I didn't get this from a poem or from some sort of subjective, nice Hallmark card. This information comes from a study performed by Texas A&M University on security and national issues by a scholar whose name is Dr. Valerie Hudson. She wrote a book called Sex in the World, and she spent years studying 130,000 data points worldwide and ranking countries according to the disparities that she saw. And as a result, she came to this conclusion that it's not wealth, it's not democracy, it's not ethno-religious composition of the country, in fact, is how women are treated. And she even made sure that there were 2 independent assessors for each one of these countries that gather consensus. And what Hudson found was that the larger the gender gap between the treatment of men and women in society, the more likely a country is to be involved in intra and inter-state conflict, to be the first to resort to force in such conflicts, and to resort to higher levels of violence. And of course, when you have war as a component in these countries, then it even exacerbates that gender disparity. So the days when one could claim the situation of women had nothing to do with national security, those days are over. There's a very clear scientific link between the two. And that's why I'm so thankful that the committee has brought this up, because I think the primary challenge for the 21st century is precisely this one, is to eliminate violence against women, to get rid of the boot camps that are created when there are abusive relationships in the household, and ultimately that will improve world peace. Unfortunately, as you know, women are particular victims of certain kinds of crimes that become weapons of war. One of them is rape. I have traveled the world interviewing women who have been raped during war. When we talk about rape in the United States, perhaps we think of it as something that happens at a party or date rape, but these women are victims of the most atrocious abuse of power that you can imagine. For instance, in the Congo, there are over 200,000 women and children who have been raped during the conflict there. Estimates for South Sudan are in the thousands. This is already stunning. And the UN think that these numbers are actually much higher. And that is because women, if they survive the attack, rarely tell anyone. And that is because, and this 16-year-old, this woman who was raped when she was 16, she's now 28, explains, rape is a weapon even more powerful than a bomb or a bullet. At least with a bullet you die. But if you have been raped, you appear to the community like someone who is cursed. After rape, no one will talk to you, no man will see you. It's a living death. In her particular case, when she was 16, soldiers attacked her village. They tortured and then killed all the men. And then they stripped all the women and girls, staked them to the ground, and let them be used by any passing soldier. She doesn't remember how many men raped her. She remembers that when the women passed out from pain, there was water thrown on their faces to be revived. After she was saved, she spent 7 years in a hospital, not because she was ill, but because she could not allow anyone to touch her. There's another issue associated with rape in Congo, and that is that when a woman becomes pregnant from a rape, the husband will be embarrassed that he was not able to protect her. So the husband will either throw the raped pregnant woman out of the house, or when the child is born, the husband will become abusive to both the women and the child. In Eastern Congo alone, there are over 50,000 children born of rape. And you would think that after knowing about these statistics, this would be a crime against humanity. It wasn't until 1998, 30 years ago, that the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia made it into a crime against humanity. And that is because they discovered that the Serbs were keeping rape camps. It's estimated that at least 60,000 women lived in those camps and were raped regularly and daily. In Rwanda, of course, as you know, rape was used as a weapon of war. Unfortunately, when peacekeeping troops arrive, that doesn't make the situation any better. In 6 out of 12 countries studied by UNICEF, the arrival of peacekeeping troops is associated with rapid rise in child prostitution, meaning that peacekeeping soldiers recruit girls in the camps for sex work. Sex work is the only way to survive. Why is this, and why are we talking about war on women? And that is because when you have that kind of conflict, it signals a change in the social order. And violence against women escalates because there are no more cultural controls, and it's used as a war and as a propaganda tool. I like to talk about 3 places in the situation for women. One in conflict, the other one after conflict, and then another one away from conflict. The first one is Afghanistan. For women, women's religious freedom, war is always bad. But when you have a patriarchal society, it's a death note. There are few geographical locations that are worse than Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, after a 10-year war there are at least 2.5 million widows. Most of these widows are kids, because early marriage in Afghanistan is not only allowed but condoned and protected. That makes the average widow in Afghanistan 35 years old. Tragedy doesn't end when your husband dies in the war. Afghani widows are mostly unaware of their rights. They're stigmatized by religious tradition in their villages. And about 94% of widows in Afghanistan cannot read or write. A huge number of girls between 15 and 19 are made victims of war. And when they're widowed, they're a sign of bad luck. So they have to wait 2 years, after which the brother-in-law will marry her and take all her assets and property. However, in Pashtun, which is a very large part of the country, things get worse. When you marry and you don't last more than 9 months, then what happens is that you are seen also as a sign of bad luck. So custom dictates that a widowed woman who lost her husband within 7 months has to go into social isolation, cannot attend wedding ceremonies, cannot talk loudly, cannot be seen enjoying herself, cannot wear colorful clothing, jewelry, or use makeup. So what that means is that these women spend most of their time on the streets begging. The other situation is in Sri Lanka. You would think that after a war ends, that there would be a respite for women. But in Sri Lanka, there were a lot of widows after the war, in the millions. And what happened was that traffickers moved into these cities and offered these women work in Amman. So there was a 16-year-old who was hoping to go to Amman for work. And instead, she was locked in a household all night long, only released to work, and she was never paid. When she was rescued, she said that at least 20 of her friends had also signed up with the same work agency. So these women become victims of trafficking, victims of sex trade. Away from conflict, in Greece. So there are situations in Greece where Christians have migrated from Turkey or from Syria. But unfortunately, when you enter a camp, the same kind of tensions that you have in the Middle East between religions appear in the camps. In the case of this 18-year-old and 19-year-old who had converted from Islam to Christianity, when they went to the camp, their tent was doused with gasoline and they were set on fire. And when they ran out and tried to get the police said that they were too afraid to go to the camp. So eventually they became refugees in Greece in a church where they cannot have work permits, where they cannot make a living, where there are in between two hellish situations. Finally, I'd like to talk briefly about Iraq. As you know, before the war, there were over 2 million Christians in Iraq. Now there are less than 200,000. That's a travesty, and that's why both the United Nations and our country have pronounced that there's a genocide against Christians. But there's another genocide, and the genocide against the Yazidi. The Yazidi people, as you may know, are individuals that are considered heretics by the Muslims. They have been the victims of several campaigns led by ISIS and by ISIL. And when ISIS took over Iraq, the first thing they did, they went to the Sinjar province in the mountains, and they attacked 300,000 Yazidis who lived there. They kidnapped 3,000 women and girls after they decapitated many of the men. The mass graves are only being discovered now. And these women were sold in open markets for slavery, sexual slavery. Unfortunately, we have a lot of evidence that it was not only Iraqis that were participating in these open markets, there were also Europeans, there were also Americans. So these women sometimes were sold 25 to 30 times within 1 year. They were technically married and then divorced each time. And then many of them went to the border where there are scouts that will find these women, identify the family, and try to sell them back to the family. But the family oftentimes don't have the $10,000 that it would take to get their daughter released. I met with a Yazidi gynecologist in Iraq who has given up her career and has devoted herself just to helping rescued Yazidi women. And she told me that just the day before I met with her, she had met with a Yazidi woman named Laila. Laila didn't want to close her eyes, and obviously she was very affected. And she asked Laila, "Why don't you want to close your eyes?" And she said, "Because every time I close my eyes, I see him." Well, who's that? Well, it turns out that she was trapped in an ISIS camp about the 12th or the 13th time that she was sold again. She and her friend decided that they were going to try to escape. As they were trying to escape, they got caught, and her friend was beheaded in front of her, and she was pardoned but sold 20 more times. These women when they come pregnant, cannot join their community again. They're considered tainted by the Yazidi. Even though the head of the Yazidi has come up with a purification ritual, the culture is so entrenched that they think that these babies that they're going to have are evil because they came from ISIS people. So the women have no recourse in Iraq. They're considered dirty by the other Iraqi communities, so they cannot work in any cooking industry. They don't want their children, but they can abandon them either. And they cannot return to their families and to their communities either. Sometimes when I speak about these topics, my husband says that he's the cocktail conversation killer of all time. I often speak about female genital mutilation. I will not speak about that now as a weapon against women. By the way, it's happening here in the United States, 500,000 girls at risk. But I always tell him that even though I see the underbelly of human rights violations, I also see the most inspiring people joining forces to fight what should never happen. And we live such easy lives in this country. We are, our first world problems, our charger is not long enough to reach the cord, to reach the socket on the wall. Our pillows are not soft enough. We didn't have hot water this morning. And I think we have a special obligation in this country to advocate. All of you are here on the Hill and are listening to this talk because I assume you're also invested in human rights world. But no life is worth living if it's not given for others. And I encourage you to find ways to learn more and also to recruit young people to learn more about this. I am oftentimes shocked that American students are not only unaware of what's going on in other countries, they don't even know where the country I'm speaking about is located geographically. I love this country. My father gave up his life in Cuba so I could have freedom. And I tell my children that their duty is to make sure that they don't live life just for themselves, but that they find a way to live life for others. So thank you very much for having me speak about this topic. I think I'm the only thing standing between you and a drink, so I should go ahead and wrap up. Thank you very much.
Great to be here. George, I don't ever find enough time to consult the ancients as much as I'd like, and I do now and then in my movie Gods and Generals. Those of you who have seen it might recall the scene when the Yankee Army is about to cross the Rappahannock River to invade Fredericksburg in December 1862. And I had a feeling that I had seen this before, and of course everything's happened before. And I found where that was written. It was written by Lucanus. Lucanus was writing in about 100 AD, and Lucanus was talking about Caesar crossing the Rubicon, which the Roman army was not allowed to do any more than the Yankee army was allowed to be down investing an American city. So I put the words of Lucanus in the mouth of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. That's an act of imagination, of course, because we don't know what Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain actually said on that day. But in addressing that and in seeing it, of course, the subtext was that the more things change, the more they say the same. And the other day, I was visiting Seneca, and I came across this passage, and I thought, well, and thank you, George, for allowing me to share it with you all today, because again, the more things change, the more they say the same. So here's Seneca writing about the same time as Lucanus, about 100 AD. He's talking about when a nation gets angry, when a whole nation gets angry. Other vices seize individuals. Anger is the one passion that sometimes takes hold of an entire state. Never has an entire people burned with love for a woman. No state in its entirety has placed its hope in money or profit. Ambition seizes men one by one on a personal basis. Lack of self-restraint does not afflict a whole people. But men and women, old men and boys, the nobility and the rabble are in accord. And the whole crowd, spurred on by a handful of words, succumbs to a greater passion than the one who spurred them on. They rush at once to weapons and firebrands, declaring war on their neighbors or waging it against fellow citizens. Entire houses are consumed by fire, root and branch, and the man who was lately admired for his eloquence and held in high esteem is now the victim of his own followers' anger. Legions hurl javelins at their own commander. All the common people are at odds with the nobility. The Senate, that takes counsel for the state, does not wait to levy troops or appoint a commander, but chooses extempore leaders to realize its anger, and hunting down its noble victims through the houses of the city, enacts punishment by its own hand. International law is broken, and embassies treated with outrage, and a madness beyond words sweeps away the state, with no time allowed to let the public tumult subside, as fleets are launched at once and loaded with riotous troops. With no customary preparation, no omens taken, the people, led by their anger, go forth, wielding as weapons whatever they have snatched up as chance provided, until a great disaster makes them atone for the rash boldness of their anger. Thanks for allowing me.
I had recently seen the recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, Nadia Murad, a Yazidi survivor, speak on all of her experiences and the work that she hopes to do. One of the things I'm taking away, unfortunately, from your talk is that the cultures in which this is happening the most, whether it be in the Congo or the Yazidi community, is that the weapon is effective because the communities ostracize these women. They fold inside themselves. It's actually effective. Like you said, it's like death beyond. And I was just wondering if you had any sense in these communities when you're talking to people, whether there are movements within, among the women to reverse the cultural attitudes about rape, so that they sort of become a force to be reckoned with, so that the rape doesn't work in an existential sense. I mean, are these women doing anything to change the culture? I know it's like you have religious, ferocity here, but is there anything being done to sort of deflect the negativity, the ostracization of these women?
Yeah, changing the culture is extraordinarily difficult. And you all know Nadia Murad was kidnapped by ISIS at age 19, also married off several times, sold several times, and she escaped and she survived, but her entire family was killed in the process. And she has started a foundation precisely to help women. But last time I was in Iraq, I went to a Yazidi camp that had a larger population, had 70,000 people in the camp, 70,000 people. And the the Italian government had donated tents that were meant for temporary housing. So in the case of the Yazidi community, they are stuck in Dohuk, and Sinjar province, which is several hours away by car, is being invaded. Erdogan from Turkey is constantly threatening to invade it. And then, I'm sorry, I'm jet lagged. I just flew in from Rome. I'm not drunk. Maybe later I'll have some wine, then you'll really hear my accent. But so if you leave the camp, you're not able to return to the camp. A lot of the women there were committing suicide, either because their daughters have been taken. I think there is zero chance of changing the culture unless you change the influencers. And in this case, the influencers are the religious people. So, and in that sense, this administration has done an excellent job, because in times past, USAID didn't necessarily want to contract with faith-based organizations. And the World Bank eliminated its program to work with faith-based organizations. And both of those programs have been resurrected in USAID, and the World Bank just 2 weeks ago named someone to work with a faith-based organization. So I found that when I spoke to a religious leader and the religious leader got it, whole communities could change. But it had to come from the religious leader, sort of releasing the women from that shame, and then the men would comply. So that's
just as a follow-up, in the Congo, is it the same thing? Is it a religious-based?
In the Congo and in Nigeria, it's a combination of factors. So, for instance, in Nigeria, about 50% of the population is Muslim, 50% Christian, but polygamy is traditional. So, if you're Christian, you'll have your church wife, and then you'll have 10 more wives in the tribe. If you're Muslim, you only have your 4 legal wives, so then you'll have 50 more when you get to your community. And so in that case, religious leaders are pretty limited. In the Congo, it has to do with an expression of manhood. The fact that you're allowed your wife to be raped, it shames you. So there's a fantastic NGO that has a program now for 5,000 men where the men come in for 6 weeks and they're trained on how to be good husbands. And many of the men said, I didn't know someone else had been raped in my community, and there were 5,000 women raped because they keep it as a secret. And that has lowered the level of abuse against women. There's another NGO in Africa that I find very interesting that will give a cow to the family if they do not perform FGM on their daughter. And as a result, they have been able to save tens of thousands of women. And as a result, then they have a better prospect in terms of health and longevity.
It's a horrible question because I don't even know begin to know what the answer, but the question is kind of what can we do? Here in the U.S., other than, we just keep advocating about it, but is there anything else that you can tell us that we should?
One of the most significant improvers of life in these countries for women is religious freedom. Because that means that they're able to have the dialogue internally and externally. So in this country, upholding the values of, for instance, the International Religious Freedom Office at State Department and the ambassador there, but also the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom, where I serve, even though I'm speaking here in my personal capacity. That's a volunteer unpaid job, which is a privilege for me to serve in that commission. USERF is up for reauthorization and reappropriation, and unfortunately, religious freedom has become a tool of the left and the right. So there is this fight every year about whether or not USERF is going to be reauthorized, about whether religious freedom for all is something that has any value. And we know for a fact, because there are all these studies, it improves the economy, but it radically improves the life of women when women are able to say, hey, I'm not going to go to Sharia court because I'm not Muslim, therefore I get to keep my property. That's a huge problem in Africa. If you're in a Muslim community and there's no civil court, you go to a Sharia court, your husband dies, the husband's family comes, takes your property, and you're homeless and you're not able to move forward. In places like in Iraq, the same situation has happened. And there were 2 million Christians, there are only 200,000 left. Nothing says Iranian influence, like Bertolo was a Christian town, and now their local elementary school is called the Ayatollah Khomeini School. And these people want to move, the Christian community wants to move back to Iraq. And unfortunately, because of security issues. So talking to your member of Congress and saying, how do we maintain religious plurality in the Middle East? Is crucial. So being involved, and the thing is, people always think that things start in Washington. No, things end up in Washington like a big garbage bag. I mean, remember that Sarah Palin was sitting at a desk in, I was going to say seeing Russia, but that's not true, in Alaska. And also, Senator Obama was a councilman in Chicago. They came from those local elected positions to occupy positions of great power. And we lose track of that. So the average American thinks that these national issues they cannot do anything and they don't affect them. So inform in your community. Yes.
Has the U.S. or the UN done anything to offer asylum and protection for these women and young girls are being violated? And the second question on that would be, is the U.S. involvement militarily, is that helping or hindering their cause?
Good, complex questions. So, in terms of the Yazidi women, Canada and Germany have been the two countries that have taken a number of them and have provided medical services. The United States has been extremely welcoming because of Congressman Jeff Fortenberry. So there's this enormous Yazidi community in Nebraska. I mean, those poor people, they went from a mountain where it's hot to Nebraska. I mean, I'm sure it's a lovely state, but they have a huge community. So there have been several members of Congress that have insisted in bringing over women and men who have been persecuted for their faith and have been victims of genocide, but there's not enough. And for instance, there's issues with, there's a new churches are always unpopular. And unfortunately, religious freedom becomes a popularity contest. And there's a new church in China called the Church of the Almighty God, and they're being kidnapped, tortured, killed, and harvested for organs. But because no one really understands, people don't really accept or understand their religion, then they are considered members of a cult. And as a result, there are a lot of immigration cases right now in the United States and in Switzerland associated with those. Military intervention. My husband's a Marine. My daughter will be commissioned in the Navy in May. I think that our military does a tremendously great job where they can. But ultimately, it's not up to them, right? It's up to the White House. And I think the importance of Congress. And Congress. Yeah, this is the whole process. This is the whole problem that hopefully you'll resolve this year, and then it'll really be Congress. But we have a lot of issues associated with supply and demand, and what is our role in the world, right? Are we the policemen of the world? Are we the peacekeepers?
Neither. We're just war makers.
Oh, well.
Kind of the forlorn, desperate question you pose, which is we shouldn't start the wars in the first place.
Thank you.
Because none of these people would have endured the incredible sufferings we've heard about the Yazidis, the Iraqis, all the other people in the Middle East, had we not launched that war in 1992, started by George Bush, and the wars we continue to have. So the best solution for all these people who are incredibly suffering in this part of the world is to stop the wars.
That's way above my pay grade, so I'm glad you said that. Thank you.
I don't have a question, but I do want to thank Kristina Arriaga for adopting one of our prisoners of conscience in Russia. He's with the Church of Scientology over there, and we have 5 people in prison there, so I really want to thank you for stepping up and adopting Ivan, because it's making a big difference.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm glad I was able to do something. So you can also there's a freedom project in Congress where members of Congress adopt religious prisoners of conscience, and very few members of Congress are involved. So that is a small but significant thing you could do. I have been interviewing prisoners after they come out of prison for a while. I was the first person to see Andrew Brunson, for instance, in Turkey, the American pastor who was arrested. I went to his prison, got strip searched, super fun. Oh, this is being filmed. I forgot. And I was able to visit him, and that visit, he says, and his book is coming out soon, gave him hope. But sometimes I would interview prisoners who were in solitary confinement, and then they would say, the guards came and they beat the crap out of me. And I was so happy. That meant someone had mentioned my name. So publicity always helps the prisoners. All the prisoners I talked to were happy with that. And if I may add one last comment, when I worked at the United Nations Human Rights Commission, I remember that people would read long lists of names. And I said, what good does that do? And I remember a prisoner who had been in solitary confinement for 8 years, and he had been tortured savagely. He had lost part of his hand, he had lost an eye. And when he came out, I said, how did you do it? And people have different reasons, right? They imagine they recreated the world or they have faith in God. And he said, because my wife came to visit me before solitary confinement, 8 years in solitary confinement. And she had the radio on Voice of America. And she said to him, whispered to him, someone said your name at the UN today. And that's how he lasted 8 years in solitary confinement. So everything helps.
I'm always getting petitions to sign for various prisoners of conscience. How much good do those petitions do?
It depends who's sending them to you.
Amnesty International, Human Rights.
Yeah, Amnesty, generally, they know what they're doing, and they know countries that are, the key is raising awareness and making sure that other governments realize that there are people elsewhere that are interested in this particular. In the case of Ivan Matitsky in Russia, his lawyer was able to use in court a tweet, right, that I had sent out from my account saying, I'm watching what's going on. And the lawyer said, the international community is watching what's going on. Look at this tweet. And we don't know in the end if that's going to have a real effect. But certainly at that point in time, it had an enormous effect. But when you get a bunch of petitions, my favorite thing to do is to focus on one case and really understand what's going on. And then, Andrew Brunson in Turkey. For the first 18 months, he wasn't even charged. And our State Department was hesitant to say that he was in prison because he was a pastor. My argument with that is if he was a dentist, would he be in prison? Andrew Brunson pastored a church for 23 years in Izmir, in the coast of Turkey. And he received a notification in his house saying, please come to the police station. He thought he was either renewing his permit to stay in the country or they were deporting him because they had deported a number of pastors. He never went back home. Him and his wife spent 13 days in detention. His wife was released, and he was sent to a prison, to a cell that was meant for 8 people, and he was there with 23 people. And then he was finally moved to another cell with 2 other people. He was accused of being a terrorist. And 18 months later, the prosecutor called for a 35-year sentence for him. Had he not been for the international community and for members of Congress and for the president to intervene, and we took turns at the commission making sure that we attended every hearing. So I would fly all the way to Izmir just to attend a judicial hearing, which, by the way, was held in an auditorium or a gymnasium that had been converted into a court. All the witnesses were secret witnesses. There was no real evidence against them. However, there were hundreds of thousands of people who were watching this case. However, the Department of Commerce, we are the #1 exporter of cotton to Turkey. It's the leading sector in Turkey. And the Department of Commerce refused to inform cotton exporters that this was what's going on. And I guarantee that had Andrew Brunson been still in prison, they would have had to turn up the international economic pressure. And it would have been very easy for the Department of Commerce to do that. And when I went to see him, his biggest fear was to be forgotten. I mean, I'm in a Turkish prison. I have about 40 fears above the forgotten one. Yeah, you can imagine. So his biggest fear was to be forgotten. When I saw him, he had lost 50 pounds. He could not see very well. I think combination of stress. He wept in front of me. And his fear, again and again, he said, do you know I'm innocent? Will I be forgotten? And the idea that he wasn't forgotten pulled him through 2.5 years in prison. By the way, he was convicted and found guilty and sentenced to a longer term that he had served. So the US government did a beautiful job flying an Air Force airplane to a commercial station in Izmir, picking him up and getting him and his family out to Germany and then to Andrews Air Force Base. So had you been writing him and had you been advocating with your member of Congress consistently, it would have been hard for your member of Congress to ignore it because you're a constituent.